You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the e-flux podcast. I'm very happy to be speaking today with Natasha Soobramanien and Luke Williams, co-authors of the extraordinary novel Diego Garcia, recently published by Semiotext in the US and Fitzgeraldo Editions in the UK. Hello, Luke.
Hi, Ben.
Hello, Natasha.
Hi, Ben. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Just a brief introduction to the novel, which is narrated by two writers who are also friends and collaborators. Damaris, who is British Mauritian, and Oliver, who is Scottish. They're in Edinburgh, having left London after the death of Oliver's brother. One day they meet a poet called Diego, who tells them how his family was forced into exile by the British and American governments. They become obsessed by this historical trauma and resolve to write in solidarity with the displaced Chagossian people and their attempts to find justice. So the novel is, in some senses, a fiction about a fiction, namely a lie maintained by the British and US governments to advance their strategic interests in the Indian Ocean. But it's also an experiment in collective storytelling, a proposal for the decolonization of the novel as a literary form, a protest against Western foreign policy, an expression of solidarity, a record of personal and public trauma, the history of a friendship, and a meditation on loss. Before we begin our conversation, Natasha and Luke are going to read a short section from the beginning of the book's second chapter. It takes place on the morning after Damaris and Oliver met and got very drunk with Diego. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Natasha.
July 2014, Edinburgh. The brightness of the morning. Sky flat, no clouds. When he came into her room with coffee, she was already awake. She didn't tell him to go away or chuck a pillow at him. She didn't swear at him or hide her face in the duvet or ask him to go fetch tubes from the kitchen, only to block his return with a chair.
She was sitting up in bed,
eyes closed, her notebook on her lap, pen moving slowly across the page. Was she awake? She put the pen down and opened her eyes. He was wearing a thin cotton robe thing of hers. She said, "You look really great, like that Guibert photo of Foucault." He put our mugs down, then climbed up beside her. He was trying to decide whether he was upset about what had happened. Her leaving him outside Sandy Bell's, her staying out with Diego. "You missed a great night."
What happened?
"We mostly just talked." He talked.
About what?
Oh, lots. The man's a storyteller. And the way he puts things. Some guy in a wig made my sister British.
And what about Diego?
Born too late for a British passport.
Is that what you're writing down? Things he said?
Yes, also things he made me think.
Is that the notebook?
Yes, I'm writing in it from back to front. Daniel at one end, now Diego at the other. They might meet in the middle. Me and Diego met a submariner from Faslane. She told us about being on submarines, under the sea for 90 days. She said she never knew where the fuck she was. They never tell you. Then Diego said, "You could have been in Diego Garcia."
I made you coffee.
I don't want coffee. I want Lucozade. That's where they keep the torture cells, on ships in the lagoon. That's why they can say, "We don't torture anyone on Diego Garcia." She lifted her jeans off the floor with her big toe, hooking it through a belt loop, tossing the jeans onto her bed. She pulled a crumpled pack of tubes from the pocket. Horseman.
Then we
went to smoke out the window. The billboard above Scott Mid still read, "Straight talking money, Wonga." Last night I remembered that when my dad first joined the RAF, they sent him out to Gam. That's like 200 miles south of Diego Garcia. I'm sorry I left you last night. I'll never leave you again. It's just we wanted to talk in Creole. You didn't have to talk. I'm fucking crawling with stories.
Write them down at the library.
I don't know if I can. I don't feel so good. The light hurts.
Put your sunglasses on. I'll treat you like a star in rehab.
The meadows, buskers. Her walking on ahead, his hand on her shoulder. The sadness as always. But today it was funny. How sad things were. How shit we felt. We were ridiculous. She was feeling better. She felt a charge of happiness and broke into a run. He noticed that her check shirt was buttoned up wrong. He found her standing next to a busker. She leaned over and whispered in the busker's ear. The busker nodded, started to play, something sweet and broken, like birdsong, and then she began to sing, and then he did too. She has a frail voice that cracks sometimes, and his is maybe too low, but we didn't mind. Sunrise and love, 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 love everlasting. The bright sun, the dust of the path, a tear, now tears rolling down her cheeks, seeming sad, but also joyful or comic because of her shades, which was odd, shades and tears, like celebrities at funerals or stars in rehab. Her nose started to run, and she wiped the snot with the back of her hand, the way boxers in their gloves do. She ran off towards the Swedish cafe.
Thank you so much, both. It's so nice to hear you read it again. It's been a while. Perhaps the first thing to start with is that, as the listener will have noticed, there's quite an unusual narrative perspective in the book. We have Oliver and Damaris speaking individually, and in the text they're referred to as he and she when they speak, or their actions are related. But collectively they're we, which is something that you communicate through the reading. Perhaps you can just start by explaining how you came to this way of writing, this first person plural for the two narrators and the third person when they're being addressed individually.
Sure. I think the first thing to say is that when we approached this collaboration, we weren't aware of many novels, particularly, but texts outside maybe literary criticism and philosophy that were written collaboratively. And those that were tended to be quite smooth, which is to say the collaboration wasn't seemingly apparent at the level of the text of the page. It was, more like a kind of a harnessing of skills to produce a coherent novel. So what we wanted to do is really highlight the collaboration at many different levels. And one of those levels was at the level of grammar. So right from the beginning, we knew we somehow wanted to register this dual authorship at the level of the sentence. In terms of how it happened, Natasha, I don't exactly know. I think it was more trying things out. Much of the novel started just through conversation rather than one of us or two of us sitting before our computers trying to narrate a story. So I think my best answer, I don't know if you've got a clearer memory, is it emerged out of our conversation and I guess kind of took flight on the page.
Yeah, I think that resonates with my memory of the process, although it's so long ago. The book as a whole emerged through conversation. That was the kind of keystone to the collaboration. But in terms of the voice and the inscription of the collaboration within the grammar, there was also a kind of resistance to smoothness or homogeneity that I think you're talking about, Luke, in terms of a collaboration. Some collaborative writing is produced in a way as though to kind of erase the idea of collaboration in order to kind of have a kind of unified authorial voice, which we didn't want for this book. We wanted it to bear the marks of the traces of our collaboration, let's say. So I think that was really what was behind this kind of quite weird, slightly clunky sometimes shifting between the points of view.
One other aspect, particularly when we moved from the first person plural, the we voice, to the he and she, I didn't realize this at first. I think Natasha was way ahead of me here, but what I eventually realized was that it's not, when it moves to the he, it's not him writing him or the he. And similarly, when she is writing she, it then moves between us. So sometimes he or I write her, and sometimes she writes me, and then sometimes we write together.
It was never a like for like transposition in that way, regardless of the fact that we are obviously clearly drawing on biographical details in creating these characters. We both wrote both of the characters.
I think this idea of how it's possible to foreground rather than erase, as you put it, Natasha, the cracks between the voices is something that we'll return to shortly. But I think perhaps it's also worth, at this point, introducing some of the different histories and voices that are part of the book, actually, which not only has these two narrators' voices, but is also interpolated with legal documents relating to the history of the island of Diego Garcia and numerous other references to citations of artworks, theorists, and activists involved in the struggle. So just to situate the listener a little bit, perhaps you could just tell us about Diego Garcia, both the character in the novel and the history of the island from which his family was displaced, which becomes this kind of obsession around which the narrators construct a fiction, let's say.
Sure. What I'll do is I'll give an overview of the history of Diego Garcia, and then Luke, you can maybe talk a bit more about Diego the person, who the two characters encounter.
Sure.
So Diego Garcia is the largest of the islands in the Chagos archipelago in the Indian Ocean. Historically, it belongs to the country of Mauritius, which was previously a British colony, but in 1968, Mauritius ceded the Chagos Islands to the British in exchange for independence. The British government then created a new colony from the Chagos Islands called Biot, which stands for British Indian Ocean Territory. And this was at a time when the will of the international community was towards decolonization rather than the creation of new colonies. But what the Mauritian government didn't know at the time is that the US government had approached Britain with a plan to lease Diego Garcia for the construction of a strategic military base in return for a discount on the purchase of Polaris missiles. So this deal went ahead, and as part of it, the British government forced the Chagossian people to leave the islands. So the Chagos archipelago is the homeland of the Chagossian people who had lived on these islands for generations. They're the descendants of the enslaved people who were forcibly brought there by French colonizers. And this forced expulsion happened between 1968 to 1973. The British government sent the Chagossian people to lives of despair in Mauritius and the Seychelles, which are around 1,800 kilometers apart, so splitting up families and very close communities. And this is, of course, an illegal act under international law. But the British and US governments conspired to lie to the UN, creating, in their words, a fiction about the status of the Chagossians as a people. And they claimed instead that the islands were in essence uninhabited except for itinerant workers. And the Chagossian people have been fighting for their right to return ever since. So they've been pursuing a number of high-profile international court cases, which culminated in a landmark ruling by the International Court of Justice, which ruled that Britain has no sovereignty over the Chagos Islands, and the UN has called upon Britain to complete its partial decolonization of Mauritius and to hand back the Chagos archipelago.
Thanks, Natasha. And this history is introduced into the novel by the character of Diego Garcia, who the narrators meet very early on and tells them his personal history. And perhaps you could just tell us about how that serves as a catalyst for the novel, how it becomes the core of this new fiction that I guess the narrators are building out of an existing fiction, as Natasha just described, this founding or foundational lie about the status of the Chagossian populace.
Yeah, Diego is a character who the two narrators meet, as you mentioned, one night in a pub in Edinburgh. They get to know him very briefly, and she, Damaris, and Diego spend the night talking. And the next morning, and that was the morning that we read at the beginning of this conversation, she's full of stories. She's excited about this new knowledge. New, not in the sense that she didn't know or they didn't know about Diego Garcia, but new in terms of, I guess, an effective bridge between what can be quite an abstract to people looking on from the West kind of incident and a very personal narrative which affects the people viscerally. So Diego kind of maybe acts to bridge that gap in some ways, at least in the beginning, and send them off on a kind of research trip, which culminates by gathering as many documents as they can, because of course the incident that we've described, the deracination of the Chagos population, the Chagossian people, has produced and continues to produce an enormous amount of material, from court records to testimony to documentaries, also novels, songs, and so on. And the two characters, in order to try and, I guess, bridge that gap between their knowledge of the event and to try and understand it maybe viscerally and extend some type of act of solidarity through writing, they attempt to harness all of this information and write a fiction out of it.
And so I guess the character introduces this central tension which animates the entire novel, which is how to share a story that needs to be told, as you put it, if it's not your story. The character of Damaris wakes up with these stories and feels like it's very important that they're communicated and that this history is made available to people, but is uncertain about the best means by which to do it. And a lot of the novel feels like an attempt to address that issue or to resolve it. One of the obvious ways in which you're, I guess, taking on that responsibility is by writing collectively in the first place, by finding a collaborative form. But also what you mentioned earlier about the importance of acknowledging the joins between things or the cracks between things strikes me as important here. And both Damaris and Oliver talk frequently about Kada Atia and his notion of repair, particularly this idea that it's very important to foreground the means by which broken objects or broken histories are stitched back together. So when you talk about the clunkiness by which your various voices are stitched back together, I wonder if that was a conscious engagement with precisely that idea, that it was important to have the joins showing and that maybe the joins are as important as the fragments. And how do you do that technically? What were the means by which you kind of maintain that sense of something having been broken?
I mean, very quickly, I think, Natasha, you might be able to answer this better than I can. But again, right from the beginning, one of the things that we knew or understood about what we were embarking on was, I guess, the narration of a wound or a historical injustice kind of necessarily evokes the kind of wounding of narrative. So just as when you experience a Kadiata show, you're kind of experiencing a wounded exhibition or a space of wound as well as repair. So we were wanting to enact that type of wounding on narrative, and hence the fragmentation, hence the perhaps the jarring nature of both the grammatical construction and the structure of the book.
Yeah, I would agree with what Luke's just said. There's also, in terms of Atia's practice, the show that he had at back, and in particular this ongoing serial work called Reason's Oxymoron, where he is presenting research and interviews into various forms of psychic repair and healing that both acknowledge the wounds of colonialism and seek to draw on non-Western practices in trying to reimagine ways of being, but without erasing those traces of destruction.
There's a point at which I think Damaris says that the fragment is her favourite literary form. And it's quite an interesting statement, because I guess the fragment as a form is so much associated with modernism, and particularly European modernism. And actually this, I kind of wondered if the book was in some sense an attempt to reclaim the fragmentary form, to actually take the fragmentary form and create something that is constructive rather than destructive, that is maybe that moves beyond those traditions. Was that a conscious effort to kind of, redeem literary history or to advance it, let's say?
That's a really interesting observation. Speaking for myself, I don't know. I can't kind of account for how much of whatever was done in this book between us from whatever my contribution was conscious. To be honest, I think I work quite instinctively and very influenced by what I read, and I'm responding to things. And actually, I would cite Banu Kapil as a writer whose work has influenced both Luke and I, and who also works with the fragment insofar as the poetic fragment, poetry, and her concept, her book, The Vertical Interrogation of Strangers, if you know it. Have I got the title right, Luke?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there is this sense where she is actively kind of abstracting out or fragmenting these responses that she received to the series of questions that she invited numerous strangers that she encountered, women of Asian origin that she would encounter in public spaces. She would invite them to respond to these questions, and then she pieced them together in this kind of collective work. Luke, do you feel that that's a good kind of account of the book?
Of Banu Kapil or up?
Yeah, of The Vertical Interrogation of Strangers. I'm just thinking about how she kind of works also with fragmentation.
Yeah.
Her approach has been very inspiring. So I would.
I would agree 100% with that. What I would add is that Banu Kapil is working with testimony and transcription.
Yes.
And for me, and I don't know if you would share this, but my if there was any engagement with, modernism or the fragment, it wasn't so much through the kind of the modernist fragment, perhaps that you described then, but through traditions of working with testimony. So I'm thinking of someone like Svetlana Alexievich, who herself traces her roots back to Dostoevsky and the dialogic novel, and the idea that a novel can be many different things at the same time, which is to say represent a myriad of viewpoints without ever agreeing on a single one. So for me, Banu Kapil is a really important touchstone because, she's working with a fragment, but I think that fragmentation is really motivated in a really exciting way by her method of working, which again is through conversation, through asking people questions, recording that, transcribing that, and building a text through that.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting distinction there, isn't there? I guess the modernist fragment is almost a testament to the fracture of the individual voice, or the idea that there exists a kind of universal subject position, where actually, if you're talking about Banu Kapil or Svetlana Alexievich, it's about taking multiple and not necessarily perfectly correlated positions and creating out of them a new infrastructure. And that seems to be interesting as well. You talked about the kind of the undermining, let's say, of the individual author's authority. And actually, I think that's something we're very familiar with talking about, the idea that, it's always important to question or to interrogate any subject position. But actually, it seems to me like, a lot of what you're doing in Diego Garcia and a lot of what those authors are doing is actually not just forcing us to question perspectives, but also building new forms of authority, which are maybe dispersed, which are collective, which incorporate many different voices, and actually how it's possible to build almost coalitions between those things. And I wondered, you say at the start that this is, I think something like this is a book which is we are still writing, and there's this sense of it being unfinished. And I wonder if you think about that collection of voices expanding out beyond the book as it's written and into all of these different histories and literatures. There's so much reference outwards, and it feels like you're very frequently pushing the reader out to seek other things out. Texts are quoted or cited, films are referred to. So if you think of that network as expanding beyond your kind of two initial narrators and then further outwards, and whether the book is always unfinished, I suppose, in that respect.
I think you're absolutely right. I think one of the reasons that we wanted to collaborate, or at least I wanted to collaborate, was a sense of frustration at the divide between, I guess, life and writing that I had certainly fallen into when I wrote my first novel, more or less alone. And this idea that somehow you're writing about life but not living it at the same time. And it seemed that by pairing up with Natasha, who, well, we'd been friends for a long time before we started writing the book together, that it could kind of smooth over, or even not exactly obliterate, but more or less, let's say obliterate that hard line between life and writing, in the way that, we looked to many artists who had successfully kind of achieved that type of merging. But for a writer, it felt very refreshing. And I think as we continued through the book, we came to realize that, like, the labor of writing a novel, yes, it was sitting in front of your computer, putting words down into the word processor, but it was also many, many other things, from cooking to childcare to mutual support, and a million other things that involved living. And for me, that was the start of a realization, I suppose, that novels aren't hived off from life and should be part of life. And kind of when it was going really well, I would say it felt like we entered into a kind of continual practice of writing, which speaks to the unfinished nature of the book. But certainly, and I think maybe, Natasha, you might be better than me at talking about how the collaboration might open up beyond our friendship and our writing life. Definitely, we're interested in further expanding the collaboration.
Yeah, this point you make, Ben, about pushing the reader outwards. I'm happy to hear that you've had that experience, because that's certainly what we wanted to do with the book. The main reason for writing it was to push the reader towards this story of the Chagossian people's struggle. And we were motivated. One of the motivations for writing this book was the fact that we were cultural workers. We worked with many people who from outside of the Chagossian and Mauritian community, who are otherwise, really well informed, very, very politically engaged, highly educated. And we were shocked by how few of the people we worked with in this way were aware of this story. So this idea of pushing the reader, certainly, the information is out there. We have drawn on, as we said, legal papers, Chagossian people's testimonies through documentaries and so on. It's all out there, but we just felt that it was this idea of trying to somehow do the work of synthesizing this information in a way that made it to present the reader with this was something that we wanted to do. But so in that sense, this idea of the book and how it connects with the world, I guess the project emerged from conversation, as we said earlier, but it's not, Luke and I do not want to be in conversation exclusively with one another. It's also about using the book as a means to have conversations with other people, to begin conversations. And you observed that, we also write about the activism of some writers who are working with the Chagossian community, like the poet Sarada Soobramanien, for example. As a result of writing the book, it's we're in conversation with Sarada in a way that seems really exciting. There's the possibility that we can work on things together. So we wanted the book to not be something that was sealed off, to be something that was open. And in the end, what we were most focused on in terms of this book was not producing a product, but in kind of starting a process.
That's really interesting, the way you talk about it. And this idea of, I guess, the book being something porous. We talked about cracks earlier and foregrounding the way that they're repaired or joined. And it's easy to think of that process like kintsugi or something, like everything is joined up perfectly and fitted back together. Whereas the way you seem to be talking about it is much more like the cracks are left open, so things can come in and things can come out. And actually It's not about joining everything back together so that it resembles, in that example, it resembles what it initially resembled, but actually allowing things to not fit perfectly or to have holes that things can move in. So we have the real world, or this kind of, this fight against an historic injustice, and it's worth making really clear that this is an injustice which continues to be perpetrated now by the British government.
Absolutely.
Where this can come in and actually be part of the book. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit in that respect about how you found these ways of, I guess, mapping one thing onto another. It's a word you use a few times. And there seems to be some kind of analogy, perhaps, between that sense of things not fitting perfectly together and the way that you overlap or graft the stories of certain characters onto the stories of certain other characters. So I'm thinking particularly of Guard, which is this kind of standalone short story in the center of the book, in which the lives of Diego and his sister Rose are mapped onto the lives of Damaris's family. And there's a kind of interesting, sometimes uncomfortable mapping, and that's challenged actually by Oliver. But maybe this sense of things not fitting perfectly and kind of deliberately mapping one person onto another, but always making it clear that it's an imperfect fit. And maybe we can move on to the ethics of that, which is a big part of the conversation of the book.
Yeah, this is at the heart of the book, and I think it's not something that's resolved in either of our heads. It's something that we're still thinking through and wrestling with and talking about, but also presenting as an open conversation and a test, a try, an essay in the book itself. I think one of the reasons why it felt so important to make those attempts to connect different stories, different traumas, different experiences was because, really from a quote, one of the two quotes that we have at the beginning of the book, which is from Fred Moulton in conversation with Stefano Hani. And perhaps I'll just read that out because it's probably somehow galvanizes what we were trying to do with these graftings. And Fred Moulton says, "The coalition emerges out of your recognition that it's fucked up for you in the same way that we've already recognized that it's fucked up for us. I don't need your help. I just need you to recognize that this shit is killing you too, however much more softly, you stupid motherfucker, you know?" So this sense that Fred Moulton is talking about, that, the types of solidarity or the types of connections between, at least he's talking here about the Black American experience of first of all, slavery and the legacies of slavery, whilst being very distinct from the white American experience of slavery, there are points of connection between them. And the idea, the liberal idea that, the white savior idea that you can somehow, empathize with the pain of others, or in this sense, Black Americans, is a very condescending idea that's going to get no one anywhere, and in fact hasn't got anyone anywhere for a very long time, because these violence is ongoing and never seems to get cease or get any easier for anyone to bear. And I think moving on from that understanding, and I suppose I would make the distinction here between empathy and solidarity. It's something that Robin Kelly, another great American Black Studies scholar, makes, would be crucial here. So the point of convergence would be where Fred Moulton is insisting that in the end, the same shit is killing you too, white America here. So for that connection that we wanted to try and make between ultimately that, capitalism, especially in its 21st century form, which seems to be accelerating, the death cult of it seems to be getting more and more vicious and naked. And in fact, it is damaging people who have traditionally been seen as the beneficiaries of it, that's to say white people, in different ways and at different speeds and with different levels of violence. But nevertheless, it ultimately is killing you too, us too. So that kind of base or foundation provided a lot of kind of motivation for us to start exploring the connections between the stories of the two characters, based very much on Natasha and I, me being a white guy, Natasha being a British Mauritian woman, and then the stories and the narratives and the testimony that we gathered of the Chagossians, and trying to make these incomplete but nevertheless important connections.
I think the one thing that I wanted to, I don't know if this relates directly, but it is something that we should talk about, I feel, to talk about Sagram,
Yes.
which is the Chagossian concept of, it literally means sadness, but it is this experience of fatal heartbreak from the experience of the deracination. People who died through shock, people who died by suicide, children who were stillborn. These are people who died by Sagra because of the experience of this forced expulsion. And clearly this is an experience that is unique and specific to the Chagossian community. But at the same time, there are analogues, let's say, or there are other kind of forms of mortal or fatal consequences of encounters with power, which is what Sagran is.
I think this idea of Sagran is so important to the book, and also maybe we can talk about your performance of the work live, because it has this, you echo each other, and when you're speaking in the collectively, and the obvious association is this echo feels like a voice which isn't present but is echoing or is haunting the text. And is that a conscious thing when you're reading it to I guess literalize or articulate the sense of unspoken voices or of second voices or of voices that aren't necessarily present in the text, nonetheless being present in it in a different way? Does that make sense?
It does, and that's a really beautiful and poetic reception of that mode of address. In fact, we didn't conceive of it in that way. It started from a very practical point of view in terms of how do we articulate the collaboration vocally? How do we read together? To read totally in unison and to try to kind of speak in sync would be to undo this inscription of the collaboration in the grammar. So it's how to find a way to articulate that. But inevitably, there's going to be a sense of kind of haunting or shadowing in that way of speaking.
There's one thing, actually, sorry, this just occurred to me when you were speaking, Luke, actually, and you were delivering that Fred Moten quote, and it reminded me of a quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, which coincidentally Andreas, another of the e-flux community, sent to me this morning, and I wonder if I could read it out and you might respond to it, because it seems to speak to this idea of the means by which connection is possible. So I'll just read it here. It's about abolition and the word abolition. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore writes that abolition has to be green. It has to take seriously the problem of environmental harm, environmental racism, and environmental degradation. To be green is to be red. It has to figure out ways to generalize the resources needed for well-being for the most vulnerable people in our community, which will then extend to all people. And to do that, to be green and red, it has to be international. It has to stretch across borders so that we can consolidate our strength, our experience, and our vision for a better world. And there was something in what you wrote as the kind of, this kind of recognition of suffering as being the fundamental base by which solidarity is possible. And from that point, it's possible to extend outwards. And Diego Garcia strikes me in many ways, although its subject matter is trauma, essentially, it also strikes me as enormously hopeful, actually, both in its form, in the possibility of communication between two authors and two narrators, and also the extension of that solidarity outwards. And I wondered if you were conscious of it being hopeful, if actually hopefulness was enormously important to you, and a way out of the sadness and the emergency in which the writers seem, at the beginning of the novel, to be stuck.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think if there is hope, it is in collectivity, it's in collaboration, it's in people coming together across, friendships, but also across ultimately nations. I think that the hope, at least as I see it, comes through most strongly when thinking about the activism and the opposition of the Chagossian people to this historical injustice. And I think coming back to this concept of Sagran might be worthwhile exploring it a little bit more, because when we were thinking of the different types of, let's say, sadness in the book, and there are many different types of sadness, most of the sadnesses in the book and the sadnesses that I think the two writers share is quite personal, and it's a type of sadness that is quite hard to speak about and share. It's a very individualized type of sadness, and we can go back to like Freud's essay on mourning and melancholy and think about, even though Freud makes a distinction between melancholy and mourning being ultimately positive because it enables the kind of grieving subject to overcome the loss, whereas melancholy is the kind of miring in that loss and the inability to, get anywhere with it. It's both very much about an individualized subject. It's very much about one's own suffering and one's own pain, whereas Sagran insists, as far as I understand it, and as far as I think we read it in the book, that it's a collective grieving. And there was some really amazing kind of encounters between the Chagossians and power. One in particular, a document which we were continually trying to search for but never found. And we contacted anthropologists, David Vine in particular, who did have this in his possession at one point. We researched in the archives in Mauritius for this document, which we never actually got hold of. But I think, if I understand it rightly, it was a sociologist who was employed, I think, by a government agency in Mauritius to kind of account for the many deaths and the sufferings of the Chagossians once they had been removed from Diego Garcia and the other islands to really the slums in Port Louis and Mauritius, the capital of Mauritius. And the reason that this report gave for the deaths and the suffering was very material things, very tangible things like alcoholism, heart attack, stroke. And each time when we encountered a response by the Chagossian community to this report and to this attribution of the suffering and death to a medicalized series of reasons, they said, no, we did not die of, my husband did not die because he was an alcoholic. My son did not commit suicide because he was, had issues with lack of employment. He died of Sagran. They died of Sagran. And it was this insistence that every death was attributable to Sagran, this kind of, this loss of one's homeland, this mourning for what is still not available to him, which is to say the desire to go home. And suddenly the sadness opens out from an individualized and individuated response to loss to this collective experience. And I think in becoming collective, it becomes political, and it has a kind of agency and an activism, as we've seen with the Chagossian community, and their incredible activism in, pursuing many different forms, from, going up to the Supreme Court, to hunger strikes, to, song and so on, that in myriad different ways. But for me, the hope is in collectivity, and particularly through connecting struggle, connecting trauma, connecting pain, and not allowing it to sit in the individual and fester. And I think we can learn, or I've learned hugely from thinking about Sagran and writing about it as far as I can understand it.
That's really beautiful, actually, and it raises a lot of questions. The narrators describe at the beginning of the book a prevailing atmosphere of sadness, and sadness is capitalized. And then this idea of Sagran offers them another way of understanding that sadness. And this idea, I suppose, that resisting the individuation of suffering, or resisting the idea that suffering can be attributed to causes which are essentially themselves effects of something more fundamental, is a way of generating solidarity between people, or of resisting the kind of alienation and individuation. And that process happens in the book, I suppose. Sorry, I hadn't thought about this before, so I'm trying to articulate it now. But where the narrators move from this very individual suffering to participation in something greater, and that maybe is something of the narrative arc. And maybe that's where the hope comes from, actually, the sense that it is possible to participate, that we're not all isolated within the bubbles of our own suffering, but that this suffering is caused by power, by greater powers. And maybe the resistance to that power consists in finding new words that express that collectivity. So this use of language, I mean, language is kind of reframed as something enormously important. The language by which suffering is described becomes in itself a political tool. I think you say at some point that fiction as well is a political tool. It's a way of putting possibilities into language. And that strikes me as a form of resistance. Maybe you could just respond to that, actually, this idea of fiction not as a way merely of reinforcing power, of imposing the structures that already exist in language, but of challenging them, or of finding new possibilities of thinking again, because that feels like a very hopeful position from which to write fiction, or maybe the only position from which it's possible to write fiction anymore.
Do you want to say, Natasha? Or?
I don't think I have anything to add to what
okay.
you say there, Ben. I think, yes.
Sorry, that was a bit of a comment rather than a question.
I've got something to say, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's a great comment, Ben. I think that the fact we thought long and hard about what we were doing, narrating this as a fiction, as ultimately a novel, and what that meant.
Yes, yeah, we did have very extended discussions around the politics of the term autofiction and whether or not this was a novel or yeah, but I remember that now.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, in some senses, it's called a novel because we call ourselves novelists, and that's what we know. And I think we were so inspired by the many different other texts that have been created, around the deracination and the Chagos situation, that, we didn't have anything to contribute. That wasn't fiction. And then as we got going and as we got further into it, certainly there was a sense of fiction being quite useful, because fiction is speculative ultimately. We're dealing with the realm of the imagination of what has not happened or not happened in the way that it's narrated, even if it's based on, historical facts. And there's something of the fact that this situation is ongoing. As you said, Ben, this is, the Chagossian people are still not on their islands. The military base that the Americans run is still on Diego Garcia, and it's still having a huge impact on, transnational war games. This is an ongoing situation. And so there's something about the speculative nature about fiction, the ability that, when done well, to ask really important questions that require the imagination, that I think fiction can do, and we try to harness. And I think, when we think about, say, the legal record, the documentation that we've, mined for this novel, it's amazing, and it's achieved some really important victories, most notably recently when the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, declared that the UK was legally bound to leave the Chagos Islands and return it to Mauritius. However, that ruling has been refused by Britain. But one of the kind of, I guess, the poverty of the legal record as we saw it was the request to the ICJ and the request to the courts have been quite meek. There's never been the suggestion that the base go. there's, sometimes the suggestion is even that the Chagossians might be able to work on the base. At the moment, the Americans refuse to allow anyone of Chagossian heritage to work on the base. It's mostly Filipino workers that are brought in, shipped in, flown in. So there's something about fiction, about its ability to question everything, that if you are looking at the Chagos case through, say, a legal perspective, is not on the cards. And, not only to question the fact of the base, but the types of thinking that exist and the types of narratives that exist that even made it possible to think of having a base on the island at all. In fact, even to have a base, even to have a war machine expand out into the Indian Ocean and so on. So, yeah, I think there's something about the speculative nature of writing fiction that we found quite empowering, and would hope that that's imparted to the reader in some way.
Yeah, Natasha, you talked a little bit about, I guess, the question of whether this is an autofiction, and it feels actually like it's entirely the opposite. Like, if autofiction is the collapse of the novel into biography, then this is something entirely opposite. And what Luke has said about actually using the form as a way to imagine the end of things, which is otherwise impossible, because it's impossible to think outside of capitalism or the military-industrial complex. This is maybe the great resource left by which it's possible to imagine and at least figure those things, that they might be implemented, and to propose futures which are otherwise imaginable. And I just wondered if you could return to that idea of expansion, of moving outwards, and how you think the novel will continue to move outwards after you've published it. This has obviously been a kind of an enormous process of gathering material and synthesizing material, as you put it. But now that it's out in the world, have you thought about the effects it might have, or the responses it might generate, or the ways that you might continue this project, perhaps in different forms?
Yes, I think, well, first of all, I just should say that when you said military-industrial complex, I misheard it as literary-industrial complex. Not wishing to. No, that was my internet connection, I think. I think I said how one of the motivations for writing this was to find ways to kind of engender, invite conversations around some of the issues that we raise, and also to kind of make connections as well. One of the things that's happened as a result of writing this book is that we wrote about 2 documentaries. Another Paradise by Olivier Magis, which is a portrait with and of Sabrina Jean, who's the UK leader of the Chagos refugee group and her community in Crawley, and the film Unforgotten Islands by the filmmaker Michel Desron. And as a result of writing about these 2 films, we've met the directors and have introduced the directors to each other. So they're in conversation now, and there will be a screening at the ICA of these 2 films, with Sabrina Jean hopefully coming to talk about the films. And so I guess it's an opportunity to kind of put things into motion that aren't necessarily related to the book, but just offer some kind of platform or opportunities that we can then share
Yeah, that's great. And I think when we post this podcast, we'll maybe include some links to
that would be great.
Both some information about those works, but also some links outside to Chagossian activist groups, so that people can learn a little bit more. You also mentioned potentially writing an essay about the experience of collaboration.
You and I were talking about the fact that, in a way, the book has only just come out, and it was such an intense process. And COVID is happening, but the kind of the first and second lockdowns kind of shaped the way that the process went. And as a result, I think it's quite difficult sometimes to do to have conversations like this, because I'm still processing what that experience was and what the book means to me, and or what the possibilities are for it in the world. So it's not always something that I can kind of articulate straight away. We're still kind of working this out. But part of that working things out, for me, happens in writing. And I think that Luke and I have been talking about working on an essay together to kind of explore some of these questions around the process. In relation to our wider reading and, the Banu Kapil book we mentioned, and also Alexievich's writing. So, this book has begun a process for us that will kind of continue. And so there will be some sort of connection between the book and these other texts and conversations that evolve, I'm sure.
There was just, I think, one more thing that I really wanted to talk to you about before we wind up. And we've talked about different modes of solidarity and collaboration, but perhaps the most striking one in Diego Garcia is, or to me anyway, was friendship, not only between the narrators, but between various different characters. And Damaris and Oliver have this kind of extraordinary relationship that, it's very funny. They're kind of a double act in some ways. One clowns when the other is sad, and vice versa, and they support each other, but they bicker as well. And I wonder if you could expand a little bit, if it's not too broad a question, on this notion of friendship as another thing that needs to be, or that can be, communicated through the novel, and how important friendship has been to you as writers, but also how important it is as a part of the glue that binds the book together, all of its different fragments, let's say.
I mean, it's the reason for the book. It's essential. It's the foundation of the book. The book is lots of things, I think, which is one of the reasons why I find it quite hard to talk about. It feels like a performance of friendship. It feels like the friendship is kind of writing itself on the page somehow.
For me, it was also writing the book was just an excuse to hang out together. I don't know. I think we started the book. I mean, we used to live together when we were kind of first starting writing, and then we kind of moved to Edinburgh, as the characters do. But the actual writing of the book came when we stopped living together. And then halfway through writing the book, Natasha left the UK with her husband and her daughter and moved to Brussels. So in many ways, at least from my perspective, keeping on writing was just, a way of keeping on connecting with Natasha, whether that was virtually or, as it happened, physically. I moved with my family out to Brussels for 1.5 years, mostly to hang out and to write the book, of course.
And because it was possible for you as a family because of the pandemic. So that was one of the things that I was talking about in terms of how the experience, there were kind of many different experiences of the pandemic, but one was the fact that you were, for a brief time, we were able to live in the same city again.
Yeah, that's true. But I also think, for me as well, like going back to what you were saying about trying to imagine alternative possibilities to the way we're coerced into living, is, imagining what friendship might be. And friendship, just like, relationships more generally, can be quite hard to move outside of established modes. And that's from pressure from the outside, but it's also internalized, of course. So in some ways, I think the book was an attempt to kind of think about what type of bonds we share, which aren't really named in relationships. Are they friends? Yes, they're friends, but they're more than friends. They're collaborators. What types of attachment do they have to each other? And this changes throughout the book. So I also hope, and Natasha's saying it's a performance of friendship. And I'm saying it was an excuse to continue a real friendship.
By performance, I didn't mean a simulation of it.
Okay.
I mean it's kind of enacted.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Yeah, embodied. It's an embodiment of friendship. Sorry.
Yeah, and another answer would be to try and imagine what type of bonds between two people.
Outside of heteronormative structures of kind of...
And the very real pressures.
Relations.
Of trying to sustain that.
Yeah, I think I think it's a phrase in the book, I'm trying to remember it now, where you describe writing as a form of sociality. And actually this is an experiment in different forms of sociality. It's quite a beautiful way of thinking about the book, I think, and what it does and how it brings people together and forms together. The idea that writing needn't be a solitary pursuit which expresses a single subject position, but might be an articulation of sociality. Feels important.
But also this model of the kind of single consciousness producing a book is often a kind of violent erasure of all the kind of forms of sociality which nurture and sustain that possibility, let's say. Certainly with this idea of the great male author in his study. Collaboration in writing has always existed, but it's not always been acknowledged.
So maybe this returns us to this idea that it's not that it's a new form, it's a way of acknowledging those influences, that actually the fragments that you're building together, I guess the politics of the book is not pretending that they're the production of a single person, but actually acknowledging all of the sources on which you're drawing, all of the inspirations, all of the labor, I suppose, and then foregrounding the fact that it's a collage or a synthesis rather than an idea imagined and realized individually.
Absolutely, and the joy of that, the joy of kind of acknowledging all of the reading and writing and listening that we do and have done to make this book.
Yeah, and I think it's also a question of like not so much creating something new, but highlighting what has been there all the time.
Yes.
And for me, and I think both of us, we're increasingly interested and committed to like, I don't know, everyday language, conversation, and, creating, whether we call it a novel or not, but a text out of that conversation, out of that everyday language. And it's a sense of, I don't know, it's not having to create narrative or create characters. It's just listening and finding ways to, activate that listening in language. And I think if you're asking, what type of work or collaborations this book might have engendered, I think that's certainly one pathway to open up the collaboration, to listen more, to work with other people and see what emerges through that and what types of narratives. And I think this question, when you asked about modernism and the book's relationship to modernism, I particularly have a kind of conflicted relationship to literature, the literature machine, the literary world. But part of the process of writing this book was not so much working that out, but stop worrying about it and not feeling like the burden of having to like answer to modernism or somehow like move the conversation beyond modernism, because I think those conversations, as I said, have always been happening. It's just that no one has been paying attention to them. So it's in a way is paying a new type of attention and finding a way that feels okay to bring that out in a published text novel.
I think that feels like a great place to finish. A novel about friendship, it feels remarkable that you've remained friends having written a novel together. I can't imagine it worse. So congratulations on that. And congratulations on a wonderful book. It's really important. I would urge all of our listeners to To find a copy, it's out with Semiotext in the US and Fitzcarraldo Editions in the UK. It's brilliant, and we will add some links when we post the podcast. Thank you so much, Natasha Soobramanien and Luke Williams. It's been really a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much
for taking
Ben.
the time
Thank you.
to talk to us.